By 6:30, the sky over the channel was turning gray. 5 beaches. 5 separate battles. And not all of them would go the same way. On the western end of the invasion front, Utah Beach got lucky, and luck, on this day, mattered more than anyone wants to admit. A strong current pushed the landing craft over a mile south of their intended target, straight into a section of coastline far less fortified than planned. The officer in charge, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., yes, that Roosevelt's son, fighting at 56 years old with a cane and a heart condition he hid from his superiors, looked at the situation and made the call.
"We'll start the war from right here."
It worked. Resistance was light. By the end of the day, Utah Beach had cost roughly 200 American lives, a fraction of what the planners had feared. Of all 5 beaches, this was the closest thing to D-Day going right. Between Utah and Omaha sat a problem that couldn't be left alone: a cliff. Point du Hoc rose 100 feet straight out of the sea, and at the top, German intelligence said, sat a battery of heavy guns capable of raining fire onto both beaches below. Someone had to take it out. That job went to the U.S. Army Rangers. They landed at the base of the cliff under direct machine gun fire from above, fired grappling hooks up the rock face, and started climbing, hand over hand, in full gear, while Germans cut their ropes and threw grenades down on them. They made it to the top, fought their way across the position, and found something nobody expected. The guns were gone. Moved days earlier, hidden in an orchard further inland, ready to be wheeled back the moment the bombardment stopped. The Rangers didn't stop. A small patrol pushed inland, found the guns sitting unguarded in that field, and destroyed them with thermite grenades, disabling the one weapon that could have turned Utah and Omaha into a massacre, using nothing but improvisation and the willingness to keep looking. To the east, British and Canadian forces hit 3 beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, in what would become one of the most underappreciated achievements of the entire invasion. Juno was the hardest of the 3. Rough seas delayed the landing, which meant the tide had risen higher than planned, forcing troops to cross more open beach, under fire, with less cover than anyone had trained for. In the first minutes alone, Canadian forces took the highest casualty rate of any Allied unit on D-Day outside of Omaha. And then they kept going. By the end of the day, Canadian troops had pushed further inland than any other Allied force on the entire invasion front, deeper than the Americans, deeper than the British. It's one of the least talked about facts of June 6th. The men who took the worst hit in the opening minutes ended the day having gained the most ground. And then there was Omaha. If Utah was where the plan worked, Omaha was where it fell apart completely, from the very first second. The amphibious tanks, designed to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide covering fire, launched too far out, in water too rough. Most of them sank before reaching the beach, taking their crews down with them. The pre-landing bombing run, meant to crater the sand and destroy German defenses, overshot its target and hit empty fields behind the beach instead. The defenses stood completely untouched. The current dragged landing craft sideways, scattering units away from their assigned sectors. The same chaos that hit the paratroopers hours earlier, now hitting the infantry in broad daylight, in full view of German gun emplacements built into the bluffs above. And those bluffs were murder. German machine guns had clear, unobstructed lines of fire down onto the entire beach. There was no cover. No craters from the failed bombing run to hide in. Just open sand, and men running across it. Some soldiers never made it out of the water. The ramps on the landing craft dropped directly into machine gun fire, and entire boat teams were cut down before a single man's boots touched sand. Others drowned under the weight of their own equipment, wounded men sinking in water that was, in some places, only chest deep. For the men who did reach the beach, there was nowhere to go. They lay flat against the sand, pinned down, watching the men beside them get hit. For nearly an hour, Omaha Beach looked less like a battle and more like a massacre with no end in sight. It was here, on this narrow strip of sand, with the entire invasion hanging in the balance, that one man's decision changed everything. Brigadier General Norman Cota stepped out onto the open beach. He wasn't crouching. He wasn't crawling. He stood upright under direct enemy fire, walking among men who had become pinned to the sand. Then he shouted the words that would become one of the defining moments of Omaha Beach.
Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here.
It wasn't a speech. It was a command delivered by a man who had just demonstrated, by walking out into that fire himself, that staying still was the only option that guaranteed death. And slowly, in small groups, soldiers began moving, not in formation, not by the book, just men deciding individually that the bluffs had to be taken, because the beach offered nothing but a place to die. By the time Omaha Beach was secured that evening, it had cost roughly 2,000 American casualties, more than every other beach combined. It remains, to this day, the bloodiest few hours of the entire Normandy invasion. And it's the reason Omaha still carries a different weight than the other names on this list. While American soldiers were dying on Omaha Beach, while Rangers were climbing cliffs and paratroopers were reorganizing in the dark, the man who could have changed everything was asleep. Adolf Hitler did not wake up until noon on June 6, 1944. The invasion had been underway for nearly 6 hours before the Führer was even briefed. And the reason is almost too strange to believe: no one dared wake him. Hitler's inner circle had learned, through painful experience, that disturbing his sleep with bad news was not a career-advancing move. So his staff sat on the intelligence reports, waited for him to rise naturally, and only then informed him that the largest seaborne invasion in history had been going on since before sunrise. But the deeper problem wasn't Hitler's sleep schedule. It was what he controlled while he was sleeping. The panzer divisions, Germany's armored reserves, the tanks that could have driven to the beaches and pushed the Allied landing back into the sea, were under Hitler's direct personal authority. No general, no field marshal, no one in the German command structure had the power to move them without his explicit order. And so they sat. While the situation on the beaches was still fluid, while there was still a window to counterattack effectively, Germany's most powerful military assets waited, because the one man who could release them was unconscious at the Berghof. When Hitler finally woke and received the news, his first reaction wasn't alarm. It was satisfaction. He had predicted the Allies would attempt a landing. He believed, thanks to Operation Fortitude, to the Ghost Army, to the fake radio traffic pointing at Pas-de-Calais, that this was not the real invasion. Normandy was a feint. The real blow was still coming. He authorized only a partial movement of reserves. The rest he held back, waiting for an attack that was never going to come. And where was the man most responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the general who had spent months reinforcing the Normandy coastline, who believed deeply that the invasion had to be stopped at the waterline or not at all, was driving home to Germany. It was his wife's birthday. June 6th. Rommel had left the previous evening, convinced by the weather forecasts that the storm conditions in the Channel made an Allied landing impossible in the next few days. He planned to return after the celebration. He never expected to need to rush. He rushed. But by the time he got back to his headquarters, the window had already closed. History doesn't deal in certainties. We can't know for certain that a faster German response would have thrown the Allies back into the sea. The beachheads were already established, already being reinforced, already connected. But the generals who were there, on both sides, believed the first hours were the critical ones. That a coordinated panzer counterattack before noon on June 6 could have made Normandy a catastrophe instead of a foothold. Instead, those hours were spent waiting. For one man to wake up. For another to drive back from a birthday party. The fate of the war, in some small but real sense, turned on a birthday and a late morning. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the Allied commanders had their beachhead. 5 beaches held. Over 100,000 soldiers on French soil. The invasion had not been thrown back into the sea. The cost was somewhere between 4,400 and 9,000 Allied dead in a single day. The exact number is still debated. What isn't debated is what that number represents: thousands of men who crossed the Channel and did not come back. D-Day did not win the war. That needs to be said clearly, because it's easy to let the scale of June 6 blur into the assumption that it was the decisive moment, the day everything was decided. It wasn't. Germany would fight for another 11 months. Hundreds of thousands more would die before the surrender came. What D-Day did was open the second front that Stalin had been demanding for 2 years. It forced Germany to divide its attention, and its resources, between East and West simultaneously. For a nation already stretched to breaking point on the Eastern Front, that division was fatal. Hitler had feared a two-front war above almost everything else. On June 6 he got one. The numbers that followed June 6 are almost harder to process than the battle itself. By the end of August 1944, just 11 weeks after D-Day, the Allies had landed over 2 million soldiers in Normandy. 2 million. The logistical operation behind that number, the ships and fuel and ammunition and food required to sustain it, remains one of the largest organizational achievements in human history. Paris was liberated in August 1944. By the following spring, Allied forces were inside Germany itself. On May 8, 1945, less than a year after the ramp dropped on Omaha Beach, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Remember that soldier from the beginning of this video. 22 years old. Standing in the dark on a landing craft, trying to remember how to breathe. Let's say he made it. Let's say the ramp dropped and he ran and the bullets missed him, and somehow, at the end of that day, he was still alive on a beach in France, exhausted and filthy and not entirely sure what had just happened. He made it. But 4,400 men who crossed that same channel that same morning did not. They weren't symbols. They weren't statistics. They were 22, or 30, or 19. They had names. They had people waiting for them. D-Day is remembered as a triumph, and in strategic terms, it was. But it was a triumph built on individual acts of courage by men who had no guarantee they would survive them. Most of what happened on June 6, 1944 happened in the space of a few seconds. A ramp drops, a man runs, and either he makes it or he doesn't. That's where history lives. Not in the maps. Not in the casualty figures. In the 10 seconds between the ramp dropping and the shoreline. In the decision to keep moving. Written in blood. Every word of it. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's next? What battle, what campaign, what moment in history do you want this channel to cover? Stalingrad. The Pacific. Ancient Rome. The fall of Constantinople. Whatever it is, write it below. I read everything, and the next video starts with what you ask for. If this series meant something to you, subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who cares about history. It's how this channel grows. And the bigger it grows, the deeper we can go. Thanks for watching.